We are, both in the sense of Mount Vernon and more specifically, the Leadership Institute. So Mount Vernon, if anybody doesn't know, I assume all the Virginians would, but Mount Vernon is George Washington's house. So the blue outline there you see on the map is the Mount Vernon estate at the time that George Washington died. That is nowhere near the amount of land that we own now. If we did, we'd be in a lot better financial shape during this pandemic than we are. But Washington, but it wasn't even this big. So the state has both grown and shrunk throughout its history. That is not as much land as George Washington owned when he first inherited the property from his older half brother, Lawrence Washington. George Washington builds it out over many decades, and it actually, then falls really into disrepair after he dies. The sort of follow-on generations of the family they're not very good at business. Maybe they should have attended Harvard rather than, I think one of them went to like a predecessor of Georgetown, so that was probably his main mistake. But in 1858 is when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association acquires the property, and they've owned it ever since. So the MVLA is a organization of normally it's normally around 25 women are on the board of the MVLA, and they're our governing body. So they're our board, and they're who physically own the property. They're the ones with the name on the deed. Oldest all-women's organization in the country. I think the third oldest historic preservation organization in the United States, and they don't plan on quitting anytime soon. That said, in 2013 is when we opened what is sort of peg as the Washington Presidential Library. We are not part of the National Archives system, so we're not part of the formal presidential library system. I think the oldest president that's actually covered by that's maybe Hoover, I believe. I think that's who it sort of starts with. So anytime, Monticello has a very similar thing that they stood up right before we did. And generally speaking, if Monticello does it, Mount Vernon will do it shortly after. And if Mount Vernon does it, Monticello will do it shortly after. Not that there's any rivalry there between those two institutions. It's just, a healthy back and forth that keeps us on our game. And so the Leadership Institute is housed in the library, and it was sort of explicitly tasked with doing external programming to the leadership of America, sort of broadly defined. So we do everything from, I spent this morning with undergraduates from Florida International University. I spent yesterday with folks from the US Patent and Trade Office. I had a call with folks from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're going to be doing some programs with us. And being right outside of DC, we also have a good relationship with a lot of the trade association community. And so, we're really trying to take advantage of our location just outside of the Beltway to where we can sort of punch above our weight class in professional development opportunities. And so what you're going to be seeing today is sort of a abbreviated version of one of the modules we do for a lot of our groups. And we are especially popular with the federal government because they are tasked with doing so much professional development in-house, but don't necessarily have the resources or they're tasked with doing a lot of professional development. They can't do all of it in-house, but they also normally don't have the money sometimes to send that many people to something like the Harvard Extension School. So, we're really trying to help with that aspect. And just for anybody that's maybe an aspiring SES or already is one, if so, good for you. But I think one of the interesting challenges we've sort of identified with the federal government in particular is that so many people that work for the different government agencies are hired for their technical skills at doing whatever it is that agency does. So, folks with USGS are great geologists, but not necessarily the greatest at managing geologists because they're just not getting some management training. The same thing with pretty much every department. So that's what that's what my normal day job consists of, is trying to create stuff that's bite-sized and approachable to these sort of organizations that want to come in for a real quick hit on professional development, especially as it pertains to issues of leadership. My computer would just operate, okay. So just to sort of very quickly recap, some basic facts about George Washington that maybe you knew, but forgot because it'd been a while, and really bring up a few that maybe you were sort of less on your mind. Washington is, of course, most famous for being first president of the United States and commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But I think sort of interestingly, his longest sustained period of public service was as a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, the equivalent of the state legislature. And that's really going to be the place that he cuts, well, I should say cut his teeth, which is, if you think you know anything about George Washington, his teeth are sort of famous. They were not actually wood, but they might have required some cutting to fit into his mouth. Washington really, no pun intended, cut his teeth politically in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and it's really where he started to learn the leadership style and management style that would take him forward the rest of his life. Prior to that, he had been executive officer and then commanding officer of the Virginia Regiment, essentially the entirety of what we would call today the Virginia National Guard. The entire Virginia Regiment was organized. The entire Virginia militia was the Virginia Regiment. And so when Washington first takes over into that, he's exactly who you would sort of textbook expect. 6'2", strapping young guy, apparently looked really good on a horse. Thomas Jefferson writes some really interesting things about George Washington riding a horse and how great his thighs looked. We won't psychoanalyze that today. But Washington, right? So he sort of learned this, sort of traditional Virginia gentry style of leadership that one would expect for somebody that had some military service. And frankly, that all falls apart when he gets into the Virginia House of Burgesses, in part because his teeth fall apart. Washington was plagued with very poor oral health throughout his life. We're not really sure what it is, but he seems to have had some sort of degenerative issue very, very early on. And that becomes problematic for him in the Virginia House because it actually impedes him physically. The Virginia House of Burgesses operated in a parliamentary style where there's a lot of back and forth debate. If you've ever been fortunate enough to watch the modern House of Parliament in the UK, it makes for great television at times. And so Washington physically could not do those long sustained bits of oration that someone like a Patrick Henry, a very famous orator of the time, would have been able to do. On top of that, Washington's finally run into a problem that he hadn't necessarily experienced. Also, another problem he hadn't really experienced during the wartime service during what was called the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, which is the period when he's commanding officer of the Virginia Regiment. And that's that his lack of a formal education really starts to catch up with him. He was the third born son within his family, which in a hyper-patriarchal society like Virginia was at that point, meant that he was not going to be heavily invested in terms of education. You will hear some historians talk about Washington not receiving a college education because his father dies when Washington is fairly young. That's not untrue. Once Washington's father dies, Washington, his mother, definitely does not have the money to send George to college. But frankly, as the third born son, he probably wouldn't have been sent anyway, because in the way any inheritance would work on paper, if everyone had actually died when they were supposed to, George Washington would have received a relatively small portion of the inheritance, and therefore he didn't need to be heavily invested in educationally. If he was sent anywhere, his two older brothers are sent to school in England. If George was going to go anywhere, it would have been to the Virginia Safety School at the time, which was William and Mary. The UVA folks always love that joke. And so for Washington, it's just not, education was something he just didn't formally have a lot of. So you can just imagine somebody that already is sort of struggling in the physical sense to do these bits of oration in the Virginia House, and then they're trying to argue publicly in real time with somebody like a Patrick Henry or James Madison or a Thomas Jefferson. And Washington tries at one time, it goes extremely poor for him. He basically gets laughed off the dais, and he never does it again. And it's really where you start to see him really focus on a more collaborative, behind the scenes approach to politics. That's something we'll come up a little later again in this presentation, and we can certainly chat more about during the Q&A portion. You know, as I've already sort of hinted at before, I mean, one of the things we've found very useful with sort of a more up-to-date approach on dealing with Washington is really sort of a warts and all examination of the guy. Back up real quick. You may have seen this painting before, or the image of a painting before. It's called Parson Weems' Fable. For those of you that don't know, Parson Weems was a 19th century writer he's the guy that invents all the stuff you've maybe heard about George Washington before, with cherry trees and not being able to tell a lie, to some extent the wooden teeth, a really weird thing about being able to throw a coin across a river. That was all invented by Weems in the 19th century for use in children's books that were going to teach leadership and act as a role model for the young men of the United States. Not very helpful though. I think to a lot of people about what you know, these folks really were like, and so we've really tried to you know, at times emphasize how Washington was able to learn from his mistakes, because he made quite a few. And then, you know, this is something I'm going to guess, since you're all in you know, the Harvard Extension School, is you're all probably very committed to the idea of lifelong learning or continuing education. And that's something we see Washington being very focused on, even though he didn't have a formal education. He was sort of, I mean, he was very much aware of his lack of a formal education. And so he tried consistently throughout his life to try and learn more along the way. He ended up with about 1,200 titles in his library by the time he died. It's nowhere near as much as Jefferson had, but that's a hell of a lot more than most other people had in this time, even folks that could afford, even amongst folks that could afford books in this time period. The vast majority of his reading collection were nonfiction books, and essentially whatever sort of new profession he was finding himself in is what he would be hoovering up information on. So when he's going to be a military officer, both times he's writing to his book buyer in London saying, go over to you know, Whitehall, where the British military headquarters was, find the bookstores nearby and get me essentially what's on the Amazon bestseller list. When he inherits Mount Vernon, he's looking for anything he can find on agricultural theory and the latest reforms, and you know, and stuff like that. When finds out he's going to be president of the United States, he starts asking around. He figures it's probably time we finally get around to reading Edmund Burke and you know, those sort of folks. You know, this Jefferson guy keeps going on about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. What's all that about? And so Washington's trying to get smart really fast. And so I think that's sort of an interesting aspect, in that he was always very comfortable knowing what he didn't know, and really trying to find expert advice whenever possible. Sometimes to his own detriment, in the sense of not giving himself enough credit that he actually had been able to become pretty smart on an issue. But that's something that we see consistently in the writings. The really quick version of this pitch I'll do, it is one of our flagship pieces, and is really looking at Washington's, I think, talented capacity to really try and see the big, or try and find the big picture issue and solve for that. So to really try and find, and try and break through the noise of the moment, and really try and get at the root of what he is trying to solve, or what he is being tasked with solving. And so as a case study for that, we sort of, it's sort of easy to use something that a lot of people are aware of, which is, the American Revolution. We are no longer British, much to some of our chagrin, because, the beer, while here is good, it's not quite proper British ale. But one of the things that I think, there's a lot of things I think are underappreciated about the American War of Independence, but one of them is just frankly the sheer audacity of what the Continental Army is being tasked with doing, and frankly the sheer elegance of the solution that Washington and Franklin and others are able to come up with. You think about it, by the time the American colonists have actually decided to sue for independence, starting in 1776, what does independence actually mean is sort of an open question. What are the things what are the aspects of, actual terrain and resources that you need to have control of to be able to sustain something like independence from a maritime power like Great Britain? And also just how do you go about accomplishing it, right? It's going to be, well, I have to do math in my head here, and as a liberal arts major, that's not easy for me. But Karl von Clausewitz, the famous 19th century military theorist, sort of loosely translated, says that war is an extension of politics by other means. And so for the Americans, how are you actually trying to apply, right? And even though they'd never read Clausewitz, obviously, because he wasn't born yet. It doesn't mean that they're not on some level aware of these things as vague concepts that just haven't been articulated in prose form. So for the American colonists, once they decide for independence, how do you actually go about applying pressure on the British Empire in order to actually achieve independence and get the British to agree to stop fighting you on this topic? And so the map you see on the screen is the British Empire in 1776. Obviously it'll get much bigger in the 19th century, but they're already in control of some very important resources. And, it is a maritime empire that its strength comes from its navy and its economy. So they've already got incredibly valuable colonial possessions there on the northern coast of South America, and especially in Africa and in India. And so for the Americans, this question of, well, where do we actually go about trying to apply pressure on the British? The only place that they're actually contiguous to and can physically launch an attack is Canada. And while Canada takes up a lot of space on this map, Canada is not actually very valuable to the British Empire. So if you capture Canada and say, well, if you don't give us Americans independence, we're never giving you Canada back, George III, the King of England, probably looks at them and goes, okay. So I have less beaver pelts. I miss the poutine, but this really isn't affecting us on a day-to-day basis. The Sugar Islands in the Caribbean are relatively close to the Americans, but they really lack any sort of substantive navy that would allow them to conduct maritime action against the British Empire, even in North American waters. They're just out, they don't have the resources to do this. And that's why I think you see in part them flounder as much as they do in 1775 and throughout a lot of 1776. And in the back half of 1776, right before Benjamin Franklin is going to be sent to Europe to start the process, sent to France specifically, but start the process of trying to really set up good relationships for the United States and Europeans, this is when I think they actually come up with a really elegant solution to their problem. Basically, they realize they need pressure applied to the British Empire. That doesn't mean that they have to be the ones to do it. And so I think one of the things that's underappreciated with the American Revolution is that by the time in 1782, the British decide to start the process of calling it quits and seek peace treaties, they are not just at war with the United States. They are not just at war with the United States and France. They're at war with the United States, France, Spain, the Dutch, and they've had basically all of Central and Eastern Europe organize a league of armed neutrality and various forms of economic embargoes against the British. So the Americans have managed to, the Americans and the French managed to really politically isolate Britain in a way that leaves it an independent actor that all of a sudden is outnumbered numerically on the seas. They're not finding ways to deny it economic viability and really hit the British where it counts, which is in their pocketbooks in that period. So we sort of term this the idea of strategic vision in the sense of really trying to get at it. What is it you're trying to accomplish? And then how do you go about doing it? And one of the things that's also sort of underappreciated is that on some level underappreciated. I think we're all sort of vaguely aware of it, but we don't sort of think through all of the implications. Is that Washington and the Continental Army are not just being tasked with accomplishing a military victory; they're actually tasked with accomplishing somewhat of a domestic politics victory as well, which is in part really helping change the relationship between the army and the population. For much of Europe at this period in the Western world, armies there's very little distinction between the army and the police. To be a leader in these militaries, you had to be some form of nobility that you normally established in the nobility from some sort of your family sort of prior military action. And so as much as these things are dressed up, they really are hereditary military aristocracies, and to some extent strongman governments. Now, depending obviously on which European power you're talking about, can be more or less strict in those regards. But there in every one of their cases, there is almost every one of their cases, there is a noble class that is somehow different than the non-noble class, and normally only nobles would have been allowed to be officers in the military. And so, it's interesting, many of you have probably seen this image before, but may not be entirely aware of what it is. Most folks that come out to our programs think that it's Washington receiving his commission from Congress. And as I'm sure some of you know, it's actually Washington doing the very opposite. It's actually him handing back his commission to Congress. Because one of the things the Army is going to consistently work on throughout the war, and the leadership of the Army is going to be consistently working on, it is really trying to set the tone of that civil or citizen soldier aspect, and really trying to establish new norms for civil military relations. And so what that means is that for the Army, it is possible to win the war in a way that they still lose. And what I mean by that is there's a way to engineer the military defeat of Britain and get political independence, but have the backside political structure of the American colonies not be some flavor of democratic Republican government. Right? There are calls from some folks even within the Army at various points of the war to say, hey, look, Congress doesn't seem like an especially effective organizational body. Maybe you, George, should take a little more power. Maybe there needs to be a little more balance. Maybe a stronger hand. Sort of insert gif of Anakin Skywalker in some of the prequel movies. Maybe the Senate should be made to understand. And so, it's one of the things that, especially because their plan is essentially to fight a very long war, right? Because the plan depends on the British getting so drained from the conflict that they're willing to quit and give the Americans independence. That means there's a hell of a lot of time for this sort of political aspect of the Army to go sort of incredibly sideways. And so one of the more famous examples I can sort of use as an example of this is Valley Forge. Valley Forge is, of course, famous for a number of reasons. One of them is depicted in this painting, which is of the Baron von Steuben, Prussian military officer training the Continental Army in a new system of drill. It's essentially, military tactics for dummies. And it's, sort of legendary within the U.S. Army as the place that the Continental Army finally learns to fight like real soldiers. And then they go out the next summer and don't do that bad against the British Army in open field combat. But the other thing that Valley Forge is probably as much, if not more famous for, is basically the privation of the soldiers, right? Their desperate need for food, desperate need for clothing. the weird sort of irony with that is that at that point in the 1770s, that area of Pennsylvania is some of the best farmland in the United States. And so the British are encamped in Philadelphia, not terribly far from where the Americans are in Valley Forge. And the British are being supplied by American farmers. The British would not have survived that winter at that 1777 into 1778 winter if they had not been being supplied by American farmers. Now, why are those American farmers supplying them? Are some of them loyal to the British? Yeah. Do a lot of them also just like actually being paid in useful money? Also, yes. The issue for the Americans wasn't that they didn't have access to food, it's that they didn't have money to pay for it. And Congress had not given permission to essentially invoke some flavor of martial law where you could issue IOUs forcefully. And so one of the things Washington spends a lot of time in general orders to the troops and sort of haranguing his officers is really trying to get them to go to their soldiers and help them understand, I get you, you're all hungry, but if we go out and undermine civilian confidence that the army can follow the rule of law, then we might as well just actually disband the army because we've already lost the war. We've already become the worst aspects of the thing we think we're trying to get away from. And so really try to understand, and so we bring this up as the idea of strategic execution in the sense of explaining to frontline workers, where they fit into the larger mission, and why they sometimes have to do things that make them uncomfortable or put up with stuff that they need to because it's serving some larger purpose, and showing how all those things fit into the whole. So I already talked on this one a little bit, but Washington's plan for the war or the Americans' plan for the war really is to fight what they would call a Fabian strategy. Nowadays we would call it sort of an asymmetric strategy. The idea being, don't lose in North America, which allows you time to win in Europe, if that makes sense, or allows you time to win elsewhere. It's not a very sexy proposition. It means that the army is going to spend the vast majority of its time running away, which is oftentimes thought of as a bad thing for militaries. But as I bring up with a lot of groups, you think of famous battlefield generals that won a lot. One of the ones that for some folks comes to mind is Robert E. Lee, who won a lot of battles, but did not win the war because those battles weren't necessarily serving the purpose of furthering some sort of larger strategic plan. And so it's something that really required a strong, consistent communications effort, both to the soldiers themselves of understanding why them running away is not a bad thing, but also to civilian policymakers in the Congress that because you could possibly see how Congress might be sort of confused. Well, wait, why are we paying you? I thought we were paying you to win the war. Why are we paying you to just run away all the time? And is that what success looks like? And so it did require sort of building into their organizational approach, this notion, building in patience into the approach that, sort of setting a expectation early on that, this was not going to be something that was going to be done quickly. At the same time, it's important that organizations be agile and be willing to make the most of opportunities when they present themselves. But those opportunities need to be things, I think, that really move you towards your larger purpose, not necessarily just things that look good in the near term. And so Yorktown is one of the more famous victories for Washington during the war, but it was not the original plan for the year 1781 to go down to Southern Virginia. Frankly, no one cared about Yorktown. It was strategically unimportant to both sides in the war. And so that's why the original plan for 1781 was to attack New York City. It was the primary British base. It was close by both armies. And what I mean by that is At that point, the Americans are in the Hudson Highlands, basically where West Point is now, so just maybe 20, 30 miles north of New York City. The French army had actually, sent an expeditionary force. It was sitting in Providence, Rhode Island. And so, both armies are already in the Northeast. So attacking New York City is sort of the easy thing to do. It seems like the obvious thing to do. It's the primary British base. Why wouldn't you go attack it, especially if it's right there? What they realize is sort of twofold. One, attacking New York City would be incredibly risky. The British have spent a lot of time fortifying the city, and it might be physically impossible to capture the city with the resources they have. The other thing is that the British screw up. I mentioned that Yorktown is frankly not strategically important to either side, which is why it's a problem that the British now, in the summer of 1781, have 8,000 troops sitting down there. 8,000 troops sitting in a position that's relatively easy to isolate if you play your cards right, and 8,000 troops that are exposed. No one cared about capturing Yorktown. What they cared about capturing were those 8,000 troops, because those are 8,000 soldiers that could or should be being used to defend something more valuable to the British, if that makes sense, whether it's a Caribbean sugar island, whether it's the city of New York itself. For the Americans and the French, here's an opportunity to conduct a relatively low-risk operation that could be very high reward, because we can deny the enemy or the opposition something that is always a limited resource, which is manpower. And so that's why the Yorktown operation is launched, and it's one that, because they've built in patience into their organizational plan, I would argue becomes easier for them to sort of flex and pivot to a different opportunity when it presented themselves. And sort of lastly, I touched on this one slightly in that last bit. For Washington, I think he was really good at allocating resources, especially human resources. So the image on the screen, or the images on the screen, are three of the more prominent Continental Army leaders during the war. They're all the senior leadership of the Army when the war ends, but basically none of them are in a position of leadership when the war starts. The only slight exception is Nathaniel Greene, who was sort of a mid-level, or actually a low-level general, sort of a mid-level officer in the grand scheme of things for the Army. Nothing really makes any of these guys stand out early on. There's no reason to think that they would be sort of especially promising. But one of the things Washington stands up fairly quickly is establishing the Continental Army as a learning organization, right? It's a startup. It had basically no organizational memory when they get it going. And so they're very quickly trying to, sort of move it, to use I think it was Zuckerberg said, move fast and break things. Is really in some ways kind of the approach the Continental Army is taking to its own organization, of really quickly trying to identify who are promising candidates, pour as much professional development into them as fast as you can, and really trying to identify them early on. So a guy like Nathaniel Greene ends up, by the end of the war, and frankly, the Continental Army's best battlefield commander. And in terms of really just sort of understanding the operational and strategic plan for the Army, he ends up in charge of the entire southern theater of the war, and frankly runs the Washington playbook in some ways better than even Washington did. But again, not terribly high ranking when the war starts. There is sort of more to this that's kind of quick, but I want to try and get this to discussion as fast as possible, because I know that especially these presentations that are online can be tiring. So I know that was really rapid fire, but now we have more time to chat with each other.
So I want to open it up to questions. Does anybody have a particular question they'd like to ask? You can raise your hand if you want, or just unmute your mic and go ahead and start talking. Well, I'll get it started here. Raphael, I'll come to you next. But where did Washington form this sort of leadership by example, moral high ground philosophy? Was there, I mean, if he was learning by books and he came from a fairly well-off family, where was that learned? How did he form this leadership style that seems to be pretty natural?
So it wasn't. I mean, this is where, I'll be honest. When this guy was in his 20s and he's that officer that first takes over the Virginia regiment, you would not have wanted him working for you. He was that guy that would have been blowing up your email inbox every day with 1,000 good ideas, and then wondering why you're not listening to him more. So he was very impetuous early on. His first campaign is an absolute disaster. The only reason he doesn't sort of completely screw up or completely have to deal with his screw up, because he does completely screw up at what's called the Fort Necessity campaign. The only reason he's not completely sort of punished for it is because the French don't bother to follow up on their victory because they think they have better things to do, and because the British government needs a bloody shirt to wave. They need a martyr. And so sort of the British propaganda has need for Washington to not be the screw up, because they need to make the French look bad, so they need a hero. So, okay, he screwed up, but he's also young, so that sort of makes sense. Because he was not anyone's first pick to even be the one in charge fully out there. He's sort of initially tasked with being the one to take the initial group of troops out, because he's one of the few people that had been, few white guys that had been over the mountains and seen that terrain. Politically connected white guys. Let me even make more caveats there. But there was supposed to be a more experienced colonel that was going to shortly follow along. That guy falls off his horse and dies, which makes it a little hard for him to really sort of calm down this young, impetuous redhead. I think Washington gets humbled from that experience, right? I mean, almost getting 250 of your people killed is probably, one would hope, a humbling experience. The next sort of time out, he is an aide de camp to a British general who'd been very successful European general, and a guy named Edward Braddock, if anybody's aware. And Braddock dies just south of Pittsburgh because Braddock was not humble and didn't want to listen to the advice of more experienced locals that had more awareness of fighting in dense terrain like that. And so now Washington has just seen, somebody that really should have known better, someone he really idealized as a professional mentor, just completely get his ass handed to him, frankly, and die from it. I mean, Washington's there when Braddock dies. Braddock actually gives him his sash, basically saying like, "Yeah, you're right. I probably should have deployed some scouts into those woods. Here, have my sash, kid." We still have the sash, and it's creepy because it's got blood on it. I don't go near it. But he still has these flashes of intemperance throughout the French and Indian War. He goes all the way to Boston to harangue the British commanding general of all of North American operations. Why am I, Washington, not being given an actual British Army commission? And so he still just, he mellows out with a couple things that all sort of occur at the same time. He marries Martha. Martha was older. George Washington's actually Martha's second husband. I think Martha put him in his place a few times. That probably helped, especially since she was the one with the money. He becomes an adopted father. So I think it's sort of, he's taking over Mount Vernon itself, and he runs up the MX really quick, and then sort of catches his mistake, and he really starts to dig into business as something that is just going to require more forethought and a little more patience. And then lastly, I mentioned it earlier, but I mean, I really do think the Virginia House of Burgesses experience is something that really humbles him early on. He realizes he's just not going to be able to run the normal playbook that somebody like a Patrick Henry operates on. And he manages to get a few good mentors, and his neighbor, George Mason, is going to sort of school him in the finer points of political philosophy, and really the one that radicalized Washington against the British. But I think, Mason sort of shows him different historical figures, so especially Roman history, that are, the soft touch approach people Washington could start to emulate. Because that's I think sort of one of the things we sort of bring up in terms of relevance of like why our programming is both unique but also timeless, is that for most of human history, the way you studied leadership and management was through studying history, and especially biographical histories, right? So that you can hopefully learn from other people's mistakes beforehand, so you're not actually making your own. So that's I think where he gets a lot of it. There are some folks, some historians attribute it to some of it, right? Not all of it in like some sort of weird way, but Washington gets involved with the Masons in this period in between the wars, and he seems especially drawn to aspects of self-development. Really seems to be the part when he's talking about being a Mason is really the parts that he's sort of bringing up. So really commitment to self-development. So I think it's from a couple different places. He's not just sort of born with it.
Thanks. Raphael.
Hi, multiple good points. Thanks for all this. So I want to just touch base on some things. You mentioned that basically from what I got that you just said is that Washington did not have a huge ego, so that served him right, or did he? I don't know. And the way that he was, his humble origins, like basically from what I'm getting is that he knew that he didn't know a lot, so basically he was constantly learning and trying to figure it out. And I'm interested in how did he figure out to pursue the Fabian strategy, to put space between them, between the British and his army, in order to gain time? Like, how did he come up with that strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The part of it's going to be sort of the Fabian portion specifically. Even the name Fabian strategy comes from a Roman general Fabius that had fought against the Carthaginians, and so that's sort of the shorthand they would have used for that sort of fight and get out of there sort of tactics. And this is one of the things that's really annoying for historians at times, is that there are certain conversations we know occurred, but since they occurred in person, we just don't know what happened. And there was a meeting with a few other people too, but especially between Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, right before so this is after the fall of New York, but before Franklin travels to Europe. Franklin was a member of the Continental Congress at this point, and essentially serving on the equivalent of nowadays what we'd call like the House Armed Services Committee. So Franklin's one of the congressmen that's directly overseeing the war and Washington. And there's a meeting that takes place at the Continental Army camp right before Franklin goes over, that I think is really where they start to hash this out, with this idea of Franklin will go to Europe, essentially stir up a hornet's nest against the British. You, Washington, just don't lose while I'm gone. Right? Do whatever tactics or whatever operations you need to do to make that happen. Do that, but essentially that hopefully help will be on the way. Because it's after that meeting that really the how the Continental Army conducts itself in the field sort of changes. And Washington also writes a few letters right after that meeting to John Hancock, who was the president of the Continental Congress, which is essentially like Speaker of the House now, really sort of laying the groundwork for, hey, by the way, we're going to start running away a lot, but we've already been running away a lot. We're going to keep doing that, but now it's actually going to be to some purpose. But I need a few tweaks and reforms in Congress. So here's sort of my wish list. In terms of, Washington was like I mentioned, definitely not a humble person early on. I think there were a few things that even later in his life, he was certainly willing to think he was the most knowledgeable person on. There's a great letter, one of my favorite letters that Washington receives during the presidency was written by a fellow Virginian, and he writes to Washington and he says, I probably shouldn't be writing this, but I've been drinking a bunch, so here it goes. And he writes to Washington saying that Washington and Washington's cousin had apparently like completely made fun of this guy one night and just humiliated him because he was holding his wine glass like a poor person. And that this guy's writing to Washington and he says, and I've never really been able to get over that, but you've done a lot for our country. So I just want you to know we're cool now. And I'm over it, which is like, well, not really sure you are, since you're bothering to write this, while you're drinking. So, it becomes sort of a learned thing. And I think, in terms, on some level, you could even, right, because he doesn't write a lot of personally reflective pieces. He's not like a Jefferson where he does a lot of self-reflection. So I think there's even an argument, there's certainly, I know there's an argument that some historians make that Washington wasn't actually as humble as he lets on, that he realizes that the humility can be a useful political tool, or the perception of the humility can be a useful political tool. It's probably a little mix of both, right? I mean, I think you can be completely humble at times and then also realize, not being, a jerk can be helpful at other times. Does that answer did I miss anything?
No, that's all good. And may I add on, like, how did he manage uncertainty? Because he seems like he was very disciplined, and how, in your opinion, how did he manage uncertainty? Because he was basically innovating, making breakthroughs.
Yeah, I mean, I think how did he manage uncertainty? I think goes to, one of the legacies we still have of the Washington administration is the presidential cabinet. And Washington, and there's a great book by a scholar named Lindsay Chervinsky. The book just came out actually by Harvard University Press, so it must be good. And she really looks at how Washington's, specifically sort of sets the tone for the use of the presidential cabinet in decision making. But that's something that Washington had been doing throughout the war with what they called councils of war. So he would really try as much as possible to get, sort of a wide variety of, or relatively wide variety of input on something, so that, if he was maybe a little bit uncertain how to act, really trying to bring in expert knowledge. Obviously, in a lot of his business affairs, there's not necessarily people to ask, but what he would do, we know through the literary or the manuscript record, is, if he would have loved Twitter in a weird way, because he was very particular about, if he found a business or agricultural book that he found really insightful, he would write to that author and attempt to set up, correspondence with them to be able to sort of ask more questions and really try and get more answers, or say, hey, I noticed you argued this, but this has been my experience at my in my farming operations. What do you think? Is that something sort of unique to my soil, or what? So really trying to seek out what he perceived as expert opinion on different things.
That's really interesting. We have a question from Joanna Quoto. How would you contrast leadership styles of Washington to other colonies' leaders at the time, and to other countries, including the English leaders in Lafayette?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's actually, we've been the royal we, I don't know, I work at Mount Vernon, I'm supposed to say royal we. Our curators at Mount Vernon have been working with the Library of Congress and the Georgian Papers collection, because one of the unfortunate bits of propaganda with the American Revolution was that George III was some sort of crazy despotic tyrant. English people know that that's not the case now, or most English people know that's not the case now. But I think for a lot of Americans, we still have this idea of, you know, George III as basically, you know, Emperor Palpatine in the Star Wars movies. Like he wasn't. He was actually a pretty nice guy, and frankly, you know, George Washington and George III actually probably would have gotten along on a number of issues. They both had a lot of curiosity, especially about agricultural affairs. So that's one. And George III's, we don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but there's a famous quote by George III where he's asked, is Washington actually going to resign his commission and just sort of walk away from power after the war, right? Because no one knows that Washington's going to become president later. And minister tells George III that, yeah, it seems like Washington's going to do it. And George III supposedly says something along the lines of like, well, if he does that, he'll be one of the greatest men of the age. Could be complete BS, to be honest. But it is something that, you know, Washington loved theater. And the reason I bring that up is he that was his, like, Jefferson loved to read novels. Washington loved to go to the theater when he could. And Washington, I think, got the idea of how to play a part. And so it's this weird thing where like a lot of European leaders at the time love the idea of Washington. And it's not that they love Washington, it's that, you know, in this whole Enlightenment era, you know, all these different, you know, European kings want to think of themselves as benevolent rulers. And so, you know, they all want to see themselves as, you know, Cincinnatus type characters, someone that can be trusted with, you know, extreme amounts of power. And so there ends up being a sort of cult of, you know, because this is the 18th century, you know, for these educated folks, they love them some classics. So Cincinnatus, famous Roman general who at the height of his powers walks away and goes back to his farm. It was sort of a shared meme, if you will, that everyone could draw upon. And so there ends up really being sort of a cult of Cincinnatus. And when the American Revolution breaks out, Washington sort of immediately grafted onto that. The Americas, in a lot of European writing at that time, I mean, you think of guys like Jean-Jacques Rousseau that see the Americas as this place that are unsullied by the corruptions of the modern European world, you know, this place that's pure. And so someone like Washington, right? I mean, this is where you really got to kind of use the air quotes here is, you know, did they actually admire George Washington, or did they admire what they wanted to think George Washington was? It ends up becoming some sort of a begrudging admiration, right? That they wish that they could be someone as virtuous as Washington. So he keeps getting all this stuff layered onto the idea of George Washington. And frankly, that's for us now one of the biggest hurdles we have to deal with, because a lot of that's still around in a way. I mean, you know, for God's sake, in the Capitol building is the apotheosis of Washington. They're in the top of the rotunda, right? And someone literally ascending into heaven. There's the tomb of him right below it in the chamber, in the basement of the Capitol building. So, you know, the Americans are certainly willing to lean in on it in the 19th century because it's good for American PR. I mean, that's why you see a lot of statues of Washington all around the world. There's actually another scholar that's been a good friend of ours over the years, been a research fellow a few times at the library, Craig Bruce Smith, is writing a book on essentially that, right? The memorialization of Washington, where this Washington's not even the actual historical character, but is this idea of what does Washington mean to you, and what is that saying about what your particular society is looking for at that moment, is sort of interesting. But so, you know, for folks that were sort of actually knew what was going on, you know, it's sort of a begrudging admiration, and you know, but I think a lot of that gets wrapped into, you know, the legend of Washington.
That's excellent. Thank you. We have another question / also another question that I think can be tied into that as well. But we have a question asking why so much emphasis on Washington. You know, you work for the for Mount Vernon. So obviously there is a specific subset into Washington there. But in addition to that, how would you compare John Adams, say Franklin, Hancock, and others before, after they had leadership roles? You know, the formation of, you know, say the Revolution and, you know, articles, to later on having, you know, now you broke the toy, now you bought it, now what do you do with it? Did they also, you know, see changes in character? Were they seen differently? Or did they kind of maintain the course of who they had already been in some sort?
It all kind of depends on which ones you're talking about. You know, and I think that's one of we tend to have such a caricature of what the founding era was like, that it becomes problematic to discuss it. I mean, while trying to keep in mind I work for a 501c3e, so I have to be a little careful of how I phrase these next questions, because I am on the clock at the moment. But you know, there was no monolithic thing called the founders or the framers, right? They disagreed on a myriad of issues, and it gets problematic in the sense of how we sort of shorthand the history, right? Lexington and Concord, maybe you mentioned Yorktown, Constitution, yay. And you know, for the revolutionaries, they obviously all agree on one thing, which is being not British. Now, what being not British means then ends up becoming the next question. And that's one that a lot of the policy issues and the fundamentals of the policy issues, they then proceed to hate each other about. I mean, frankly, are a lot of issues we're still fighting over today. So, you know, somebody like Jefferson, sort of interesting. I can't believe I'm about to say this and give Jefferson sort of a compliment, but you know, Jefferson sort of interesting in that he has a very Rousseau. He wouldn't be insulted by this part at all. He has a very Rousseau interpretation, you know, philosophy towards governance, until all of a sudden he is the chief executive. And you know, Madison's sort of interesting because he kind of goes back and forth. You know, he is sort of a pragmatic realist when he's hanging out with Hamilton at the convention, but then sort of drinks the Jefferson Kool-Aid, which is probably a very nice Madeira. And then all of a sudden, when Madison has to navigate the War of 1812, is like, okay, the Federalists might have had a few points. And so, you know, it is something that, you know, they all evolve over time, as we all do. You know, I mean, as all these different folks were getting leadership and management experiences throughout their lives, you see their tones and emphasis change. You know, I talk about George Washington the most because I've worked at the George Washington Presidential Library for the past 5 years, and that's what they pay me to research. If I worked at Monticello, I'd probably drink more wine because they have great wineries out there, but I'd talk a lot more about Jefferson. You know, Washington's the biography I know, but you know, the most of, but I mean, for all of these folks, they're constantly learning and constantly iterating their beliefs. And I would go out on the slight political limb here of saying that I think that's something we could adopt a little more of, is being willing to not just sort of stake out the one opinion and then feel like you have to, you know, that's a hill you have to die on. And certainly, you know, for these guys, you see them doing that too over certain things. And, you know, that's not to say that you shouldn't compromise, you should compromise your morals. But the willingness to learn is there in all of them, and you see all of them sort of change over time.
I guess on that point, that's a great point you make there is, you know, I'm not sure if this is a fake quote or not. I haven't Snopes'd it, but you know, Washington's credited with stating that, you know, the fear of partisanship and, you know, internal conflict. And I guess, you know, I think many people realize that he was the first and only president that didn't have to necessarily challenge opposing political party at the time, so it seems, because he had the fortune of being the first. But that being said, there were many issues that were discussed, even slavery at the time, you know, that were very divisive. And how did he manage being the first president while trying to wrangle those things in? Clearly, it only took a few years thereafter him to change all that. But, you know, can you illustrate that a little bit and maybe some parallels to modern politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Washington, you know, we'll deal with the most difficult one up front is slavery. All right, Washington obviously has a very personal interest in not being too abolitionist. Right, he at the time of his death was enslaving 187 people at Mount Vernon. There were 353 slaves, or 353 enslaved on the plantation. About half of them were Martha Custis's, right? So the Custis slaves. So even though they're at Mount Vernon, they're not. Washington has no legal ability to do anything with them. Washington will emancipate his begin the process of emancipating his slaves in his will, if not actually accomplished by the will itself. There's some caveats, with one exception: one person is immediately emancipated. But it's something that's sort of interesting with speaking of issues that sort of change over time. Washington, prior to the revolution, is not really giving any thought to slavery, right? It's just sort of an accepted thing that's in Virginia, and what am I, George Washington, going to do about it, or why would I care? You see that change throughout the course of the war for a couple different reasons. A lot of the young men that worked directly with him, so like Alexander Hamilton, a few of the other aides de camp, were abolitionist and were in favor of some, some flavor of abolition, whether it would be immediate or gradual. And they, at the dinner table, are asking, they're debating this issue, right? Throughout the course of what we think of as sort of the Revolutionary Era, 8 of the 13 states will begin processes of emancipation. So even within the Revolutionary Era, slavery becomes, pro-slavery becomes a minority position within the country. Washington is just straight up asked, how can all men be created equal if some are more equal than others? Which I think really hits home for Washington, because essentially his path to political radicalization is being told that some British are more British than others. And so it's a circle he really can't square. And by the end of the war, 25% of the Continental Army are freed, or free, either currently enslaved Africans, recently emancipated Africans, or people that had, just people of African descent that were free, are serving in the ranks of the army, right? And with no guarantee that, for the enslaved ones, no guarantee that they would be emancipated for that service. And personally for Washington, after the war, we know he never takes communion again. He tells the priest at his church down in Powick, Virginia, that there's a stain on his soul he just can't get rid of. That being said, as much as he might sort of be personally evolving on the issue, admittedly, he never takes anything of sort of an anti-slavery position in terms of policy options within the country. At the same time, he never really takes an explicitly pro-slavery one either. There's actually a moment where Jefferson's really agitating for an 18th century version of what in the 19th century becomes the Fugitive Slave Act. Jefferson's actually agitating for that earlier. Washington pulls Jefferson aside and says, don't push this. If you force me to come out publicly on this, you're not going to like what's going to happen. I think for Washington, he desperately hoped that it would be sort of resolved at the state level, and really until 1800, it seemed pretty on track to be something that the state of Virginia would go for, some process of gradual emancipation. And if Virginia did it, the rest of the South would have had to go along, because Virginia was really their barrier in the Senate and the House. It really would have become a minority position if they would have lost Virginia. So Washington's hoping it will just sort of work its way out at the state level, and he's just trying to keep the federal government out of it, because what we see as a consistent theme throughout his 2 terms is really trying to get the United States up and running. And so, in the same way that you see him trying to navigate a neutral position between Spain and France and Great Britain, who knows what Spain's doing? I mean, I know what Spain was doing, but trying to navigate a neutral position during the French Revolution. Washington's just trying to get the system set up for the federal government and between the states. And so he's really trying to avoid any major issues, which is why you're actually right for that quote, roughly speaking. It's in his farewell address, where it's essentially his exit interview to the country. And he brings up numerous times about trying to avoid anything that's going to be partisan issues, right? Whether you're not avoiding things that can be partisan issues, but not viewing things through, trying not to view things through an explicitly partisan lens, and really trying to see the bigger picture of this country could be so much more than the sum of its parts if it could actually maintain unity in some fashion. And so he harangues on not giving, sort of an urban-rural divide, harangues on not having, sort of regional divides. He brings up the growing issue of party politics. And for Washington, that quote's mildly misunderstood in the sense of Washington was fully aware that you would have policy disagreements and that you might even have sort of temporary alliances between groups and sort of horse trading like you would see in a parliamentary environment. What he was worried about was standing organized parties in the sense of organizations that are willing to horse trade on their beliefs in order to maintain the power of that organization, if that makes sense, right? So not how do we build out the cabinet, how do we build out the planks of the party platform in order to get the most votes? Well, no, from Washington's perspective, that's exactly the opposite. It should be temporary alliances of interest groups that come together over things they care about, and then it would sort of, readjust. What he was worried about was sort of standing organizations that would
like co-opt the ideas of others in order to take their base, sort of.
Yeah, or you're willing to horse trade whole portions of your base in order to just maintain power for the party elites was really the concern. Not that any of that sounds familiar at various points through U.S. history.
All right, well, if there's not any other specific questions, I think we should wrap up here, but we really do appreciate your time. Hopefully you'll do this again for us some other time, but with all due, I think this is the last official event that we are going to have as the Management and Finance Club for this semester. So thank you all for joining us. The recording will be made available later. Jason, before I close off, do you have a question, or you just give me a thumbs up being happy? Jason's thumb is down. All right, very well then. Well, thank you very much, and
Thank you.